It's a huge pleasure to be here, though I'm bound to say I don't think I'm anything like as combative as you've suggested. I think you're confusing me with David Starkey, and that would cause him enormous distress, as it causes me enormous distress as well. I'm hugely delighted to be here and to be helping to start off this inaugural panel. We were invited by Craig to give recollections of Mary Soames. I'll give a very brief one. I had dinner with Mary about a year ago as we talked about Churchill 2015, and I took her to my club, and as we walked into the dining room, everybody stood up. Well, needless to say, they weren't standing up for me. It's a wonderful pleasure to share this platform with Jonathan Dimbleby. I still think his biography of his father Richard is the greatest biography of our greatest broadcaster, and of course to share it with Margaret, who has written these brilliant books on the causes and consequence of the First World War, and who has spoken very often, wisely, sensibly, and on occasions very bravely about how history matters and why it matters, and we've heard some of her remarks this morning which exactly bear that out. So I'm both very privileged and rather intimidated to be of their company this morning. The question we are faced with today is why celebrate Churchill? And I want to refine that slightly, if I may. Why should we celebrate Churchill now, 50 years on? And let me take your minds back to 1945, the year in which Churchill, as he later said, all our enemies having surrendered or being about to do so, I was immediately dismissed by the British electorate from all further conduct of their affairs. And to mark that event, David Lowe produced one of his most memorable and moving and brilliant cartoons, and it was built around the notion of the two Churchills. And the one Churchill was Churchill, the leader of humanity, sitting atop an enormous podium, receiving the homage and acclaim of the free world, whose liberties he had preserved and whose honour he had saved. And the second Churchill, lurking disgruntled far away in the corner, was Churchill, the party leader, just rejected by the electorate. And Churchill, the leader of humanity, looks down serenely on the disgruntled Churchill, the party leader, and says, "Cheer up, they will soon forget you, but they will remember me always." Well, always is forever, and that's a long time. And we're only 50 years into the always that Lowe, as it were, invoked in that very moving cartoon. But 50 years on is a very good time to begin to pose the question, as Margaret has already done in her opening remarks. How should we remember Churchill? Should we remember him at all? And in what ways? So let me try to sharpen up those questions a little bit, giving us some indication, in a way, of the challenges that we face in engaging with those questions. In 1949, 4 years after Lowe had produced his cartoon, Time offered a corroboration for the optimistic statement that, as it were, that cartoon embodied. Time magazine, in declaring Churchill to be the man of the half-century, recognising 50 extraordinary years in public life, which no one else at that time could claim to be in the Western world or anywhere else, recognising his significance in the Second World War and as the man who defined the way in which people thought about the Cold War. And of course also, one should never forget, I think, that Churchill's reputation in part in the period after the Second World War did depend on the fact that Roosevelt had died and Churchill was the only major Western player left. But fast forward to 1999, when Time did this again. This time, and this of course is rather revealingly, not talking about the man of the half-century, but the person of the century. Think about that and what that implies about our sensibilities. And who was the person of the century? The person of the century was Albert Einstein. And who were the runners-up for that accolade? They were Mahatma Gandhi and Franklin Roosevelt. So Churchill didn't come first or second or third. So what had happened to this lengthening perspective of history, a perspective and a lengthening that Churchill was fully aware of, which meant that he didn't come in even to win a bronze medal, if I can put it that way? Well, what we might suppose is that with the broader perspective of 100 years on the whole of the 20th century, Einstein would indeed have credibility as one of the people who alerted the world earlier than anyone else, certainly earlier than Churchill, to what Hitler was doing to the Jews, and who was, as it were, in the era of the atomic bomb, the conscience of the world. We might think about Mahatma Gandhi, the prototypical leader, back to Margaret's point about India, of colonial rebellion against imperialist powers. And we might think of Roosevelt, the greatest champion of freedom we have ever known, as Churchill described him, as a man with a forward-looking notion of global democracy. So we might even want to say, pursuing that argument further, that if we are to bestow, I'm rather reluctant to do this, but bear with me a minute, the accolade of the leader of humanity on people, those three people in the long perspective of the 20th century perhaps deserve that accolade at least as much as Churchill, if not more. All of which is but another way of saying that Churchill, like all historical figures, was up to a point, only up to a point, I'll come back to this, a time-bound figure. And time moves on. And that's going to be as true of all of us as it was of him. And one of the ways further of thinking about this is that Churchill's world, the world in which he lived and moved and had his being, isn't the world of today, as that shift in sensibility and appreciation embodied in those comparisons of Time magazine serves to remind us. The world in which Churchill lived in the full plenitude of his extraordinary powers was one in which Britain itself was a great power, was one in which Britain was a great imperial power, was one in which Britain was a great maritime power. It was one in which Europe was a Europe of nation-states, the supreme high point of civilization in the world, and one in which Europe had large numbers of empires in Africa and Asia. It was a world in which the special relationship between Britain and America was preeminent and paramount. And it was a world in which attitudes to such issues as race and gender were not the attitudes that we would hold today. That was Churchill's world, 1874 to 1965, and we don't live there now. Britain is no longer a great power. The British Empire has disappeared. It doesn't have a navy. In Europe, nation-states are less important than the European Union. Europe, nobody would today say that Europe was the supreme civilization of the world, and the record of the First and Second World War would at least in part corroborate that sceptical view. European empires don't exist anymore. With the end of the Cold War, the Anglo-American special relationship has not been as strong as it used to be. If an American president now wants to do business with Europe, they call Berlin, they don't call London anymore. Churchill wouldn't have appreciated that irony. And insofar as America is concerned to look elsewhere in the world as to where it should most focus in terms of problems and possibilities, Britain no longer ranks anything like as high as it did in Churchill's time. In a globalized, emancipated, multicultural world, where the Middle East, where India and China are the most important and significant players, this isn't Churchill's world anymore. Churchill doesn't really have much to say to us about that world because it's not the world he lived in. Moreover, the values and presuppositions and conventional wisdoms of Churchill's world are not those that we share today. Now, putting this in positive terms, or at least one version of these positive terms, as Churchill moves, as he's now doing 50 years after his death, from memory to history, he becomes in many ways more extraordinary, not less. But the danger, if we do that, is that the more we celebrate him for being extraordinary and exceptional, which indeed he was, the less he seems to have to say to us today. And that's a problem, I think, that 50 years after his death, we have to begin to get our minds round. Because the danger with that is that Churchill becomes recruited to being, as it were, the leader of the nostalgia industry. And as a friend of mine said to me recently, the problem with nostalgia is that it's not what it used to be. Moreover, as we mark the 50th anniversary of Churchill's death, it's very proper, as that wonderfully moving film showed, that we should look back on Churchill's life and on those remarkable scenes at the time of his death and on Richard Dimbleby's wonderfully moving commentary. But also, those of us involved in the whole issue of Churchill 2015, we need to think about where we are with Churchill now. Is there a Churchill for our time? Is there a Churchill for the future? And if so, who is he? And that's the Churchill, very briefly now, that I'd like to talk about. And in so doing, I want, in fact, to take up Jonathan Dimbleby's point that he was the world leader who played a weak hand brilliantly. And that, I think, more than any other, although there's a huge portfolio and palette of Churchills to choose from going forward, that's the one I think we might most want to be interested in, because that is the authentic historical Churchill of the Second World War. Remember, in 1940, when Churchill became Prime Minister, not only is the European military scene, to put it mildly, pretty dreadful, Churchill was not liked by the majority of the Tory party, he was not liked by the cabinet, he was not liked by the king, and he was not liked by the civil service. And in 1940 and on until 1941 and 1942, Churchill's domestic political position was extraordinarily weak. Extraordinarily weak. And if we think internationally from 1940 to 1942, what does that see? It sees what John Darwin has called the collapse of the British world system. Britain finds itself fighting a war in the Mediterranean and North Africa, in Europe and in the Atlantic and in Asia as well. And it simply lacks the resources to fight that war on all three fronts. As a result of which, the British world system does indeed collapse. Britain is practically bankrupt, and there are these two catastrophic military disasters exemplifying Britain's weakness, the fall of Tobruk and the fall of Singapore. And one of Churchill's constant worries, again a point that Jonathan's already made, is that he doesn't think the British army is up for fighting and up for winning. And the evidence is pretty conclusive that that's an understandable fear. Well, things, of course, eventually get better from 1943 to 45 because Churchill finds himself in alliance with the United States and with Russia. The allies he's always kind of wanted and has finally got, and that means Britain won't just survive, it will be on the winning side. And indeed, it is fair to say that in a sense, it's Russia fighting on the Eastern Front and America fighting in the Pacific who actually put in most of the resources, most of the manpower, most of the armaments, and win the war. But Churchill finds himself then in this paradoxical position. He's got the allies he wants and he needs, but they are in some fundamental sense deeply suspect allies. Stalin, of course, doesn't like Churchill because Churchill has been the enemy of Bolshevism from 1917 on. Roosevelt doesn't like Churchill because he thinks he's an old-star imperialist. Moreover, both Stalin and Roosevelt harbour ambitions to succeed Britain as the great world power, even as they disapprove of Britain's empire, but are happy to contemplate the creation of their own. A.J.P. Taylor famously described the Second World War as the war of British succession. Who is going to succeed Britain as the greatest power in the world? So Churchill finds himself in this complicated, difficult, paradoxical position where in some senses the two allies that he needs are not much better disposed to Britain than the enemies he's fighting. So when he famously makes a speech in the Guildhall in the later part of the war, saying, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire," those remarks were addressed as much as to Moscow and to Washington as they were to Tokyo and to Berlin. So that's not an easy hand for Churchill to play. Yet the fact remains, in 1945, Britain is on the winning side. As Jonathan said, Churchill has persuaded the Americans to try to beat Hitler before they beat Japan. Britain gets all its Eastern Empire back in India, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, largely thanks to the Americans, who the Limeys have once again beguiled into supporting the British Empire, even as they don't think that's a good idea. And he's also carved out for Britain an extended dominion in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Libya, in Greece, and in Turkey, which was something the Americans actually didn't want him to do. And by various criteria, in 1945, the British Empire was at its greatest extent. All of which is to say that Churchill did absolutely brilliantly, playing an amazingly weak hand in the Second World War. A weak hand both domestically and a weak hand internationally. In large part, but not entirely, by simply talking Britain up. And boy, was Churchill good at talking. What is more, not only did Churchill do that, play a weak hand brilliantly, talk Britain up, especially vis-à-vis Stalin and vis-à-vis Roosevelt, but he never let on that that was what, in fact, in the course of the Second World War, he was doing. And that's why I think Max Hastings' recent and brilliant book on Churchill as a warlord, Finest Years, gets it absolutely right when he says that contemplating Churchill across the whole span of the Second World War, notwithstanding the mistakes, it's impossible to be anything other than amazed and admiring at what Max calls the sustained magnificence of Churchill's performance in playing a weak hand. And that brings us back also to another point that Margaret made about Karl Marx. Karl Marx famously once observed, men and women make their own history, but they do not do so under circumstances of their own choosing. And that's exactly a description of Churchill in the Second World War. So it seems to me that's the Churchill looking forward that we can now begin, I think, with the lengthening perspective of history to see as a remarkable and remarkably interesting and extraordinarily wonderful figure. And that's not only important for its own sake, though I do think it is. It's also because this sense of a Western leader playing a weak hand has, I think, got an awful lot looking forward to teach leaders today. If we contemplate the future of the world now, I think it's fair to say that the future of the world, whatever it's going to be, is going to be made in the Far East, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and in Africa, and in Latin America. It's certainly fair to say that America's power is nothing like what it was in terms of its capacity to bring about whatever state of affairs it may wish to bring about. And that diminished sense of American power will remain true whoever the next president is, whatever their gender, religion, sexual orientation, race, or ethnicity. They, like the current president, are going to have to try to play an increasingly weak hand as well as they possibly can. And if you wish to look for any guidance as to how to play a weak hand exceptionally well, then it seems to me that Churchill's conduct in the Second World War is a textbook example of what to do. So my sense is that as we move forward into the second half of the centenary, as it were, of Churchill's death, as we move forward into the next 50 years, that Churchill, the player of a weak hand brilliantly, still has an enormous amount to teach us. And I think looking forward to the next 50 years, that's the Churchill who not only we should learn from, but the people in charge of the world ought to try to learn from too. Thank you.